Well, it's time to get started, so take a seat. It's the Science Cafe, brought to you by OEB.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. This is our first Science Cafe of 2018, and we're really excited. Just in case this is your first time at Science Cafe, I'll give you a little intro and welcome. We are a bunch of grad students from UMass who study various aspects of biology, and we invite different speakers to come and share their research with the community. So tonight is our first one of 2018, like I said, and I have a couple of announcements to make before we get going. I just want to say thank you to our funding sources who allowed this event to happen, which includes the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at UMass, the UMass Graduate Student Senate, the Graduate School, and the National Science Foundation. Just to let everybody know ahead of time, we are taking photos and videos, so these will be posted online probably, and if you prefer to not be photographed or videoed, please let Leon or Aaron know, and probably sit closer to them so that you can be out of the shots. Secondly, I'd like to make an announcement for our end of year. I know it's the beginning of the year, but at the end of the year we're having a party called Science After Dark. It's going to be a great time, and we invite all the previous speakers back from the entire year so everybody can just hang out and chat, and it's a great community event. So please consider coming. It'll be sometime in April or May 10th, so really towards the end of the year. And it's also a self-funded event, so if you would please consider donating. We have our graduated cylinder in the room by the pizza, so please consider donating for that event, and please come too. Lastly, we have our sign-up sheet going around, so if this is your first time at Science Cafe, or if you're not on our email listserv, please put your name down if you'd like to receive notifications and stay in the loop about the cafe. And please put March 8th on your calendar for our next cafe, which will be titled Backyard Extinctions, the Plight of the Puritan Tiger Beetle. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome our invited speaker for tonight. She, let's see, was it Toronto? Grew up in Toronto. She did her undergrad at the University of British Columbia, then went on to do her master's at the University of Western Ontario, and then came down to the States to do her PhD at Texas A&M at Galveston. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dara Orbach. All right, so our first, and right before we start, I do also want to make a quick disclaimer that we are going to be talking about sex and related topics, so just keep that in mind, and it's okay to laugh, but this is, we want to keep it scientific, and I just wanted to give everybody a heads up about the topics that we're going to be discussing tonight. So, as we get started, why don't you give us a little background about how you got to this fascinating topic and your story along the way.
So, as Allison mentioned, I'm originally from Toronto and did my undergrad, which is, for those of you who have never been north of the border, it's pretty central, near Buffalo, so it's pretty inland. And I did my first two bachelor degrees, my only two bachelor degrees, in Vancouver on the West Coast, and really fell in love with living by the ocean. And even though I was not studying marine mammals and spent several years out there and never once went marine mammal watching, I realized I was happier by the coast and I wanted to spend my life living by the ocean, and I was doing one of my degrees was in animal behavior and biology, and thought, oh, well, if you study marine mammals, that's the way to always live by the ocean and always be happy. Little did I know that most people have this dream from the age of 5 that they are going to be a trainer at SeaWorld, and they start really, really young. And surprisingly, not surprisingly perhaps, working with dolphins and whales is a pretty competitive field. And people start volunteering all the way in high school and are doing internships, and most of them are paid internships where people pay to volunteer their time to look at dorsal fins and never actually see a live marine mammal. So it's pretty competitive just to get your foot in the door. I've supervised over 100 students who have put in over 200 hours each, and they've never actually seen marine mammals, most of them. They just look at photos or videos. So it's that competitive. So coming out of my second bachelor saying I want to be a marine mammologist was ridiculously ambitious. And so I actually ended up doing my master's working with bats, thinking I'll study echolocation, and that will be a transferable skill set, and I'll become a bioacoustic expert because the terrestrial echolocation world is far more advanced in terms of research than what we can do in the ocean. So I landed up working with one of the leading bat biologists in the world and came up with a ridiculous project, which it was funded actually by an alcohol company, and we got bats drunk and looked at their alcohol tolerance when they were flying. So these were fruit-feeding bats, and we wanted to understand that as fruit is fermenting, it's going to ripen, and we wanted to understand natural exposure. So I went to Israel and Belize and basically caught a bunch of bats and fed them vodka from duty-free and threw them through a flight chamber and looked at if they crashed into obstacles and if they slurred their speech. And the take-home message is that the bats in Belize will drink you under a table. So the legal limit to drink alcohol in America is 0.08 blood alcohol levels, and these bats were flying at 0.3 unimpaired. So it does turn out that the natural exposure makes a huge difference. So that was really fun, and I did lots of acoustic analysis and realized that I don't enjoy acoustic analysis, which is pretty typical, I think, for grad students to learn deep into the process what they do and don't like, so that was a valuable experience, but the behavior part was really interesting to me. And so I went in 2009 to a conference on marine mammals, which was something like a 15-hour car ride away, and I said, why not? Surely I can go to this conference and convince someone to take me on as their PhD student. And this was before there really were smartphones, and I didn't know who anyone was in the marine mammal world, and showed up at this conference not really having a clue what to do, and heard this really interesting talk about dusky dolphins and their mating, and how little is known about their mating behavior. And at the end of the talk, the research said that they have these weird folds in their vaginas, and maybe somehow that plays a role in mating, and I thought, that's what I want to study, these weird vaginal structures. And so I approached the grad student, and he said, I'm just a grad student, talk to my advisor, who is Baron Bursig, one of the most famous marine mammalogists in the world, and I had never heard of him before because why would I have? And so I emailed, and this is a conference with 2,000-3,000 people, and so I had no idea what anyone looked like. So after the conference, I emailed him and said, I'm so sorry I didn't meet you at the conference, but here's my idea. And he said, yes, what a shame I got the flu, because usually there's a lineup of students waiting outside the bathroom to meet him, just to talk to him and to pitch ideas to him. So it happened to have worked out that he got the flu. So I was the only one to propose a project to him, and it was this really unusual, he just retired last year, so this is the end of his career, and it was a really unusual project looking at how anatomy and behavior could work together, and he loved it and said, okay, come on down to Texas and let's sort this out, but before you do, I want you to come to New Zealand and see these dolphins and see how realistic this is. So before I even started my PhD, he flew me down to New Zealand where I got to film these dusky dolphins mating and realize what an amazing field site it is. So I should mention that before I show the next video shortly, that mating behaviors have not been studied for most of the dolphins, whales, and porpoises, which are called cetaceans more broadly, because it's next to impossible. These are animals that live offshore, they're found submerged beneath the surface of the water, and typically they're not going to mate just because you have your camera, your video camera out. So we know very little about the mating behaviors of most marine mammals that mate in the water. So seals mate on land, so that makes it a little bit easier, but with dolphins and whales, we know almost nothing. And also, for example, humpback whales are one of the most studied species. They've been studied inside the tropical areas and the breeding grounds for over 30 years, and no one's ever seen a mating event. So for most species, we know nothing about mating behaviors. What makes this population in New Zealand really unique is that these dolphins forage offshore at night in a very deep canyon, which comes close to shore. And so I wouldn't call the dusky dolphins lazy, but essentially they wait for the prey to come towards the surface in the middle of the night, and as the prey, which is squid and myctophid fish, are coming up, they dive down to meet them so they don't have to work as hard, and so they forage all night long, which means that they're not feeding in the daytime, so there's not that much to do in the daytime except for rest and socialize, and by socialize, I mean an awful lot of sex. So this is a very unique site where if you go in the austral summer, so between October through February, we see mating almost consistently every single day on the water. And what also is really special is that these dolphins mate close to shore throughout the daytime for several months long, and they also are very, very evasive. So there's several males chasing one female, And the female, one of her ways to get away is she'll leap through the air and the males will leap after her. So basically you go on a boat at the right time of day and look for leaping dolphins and you're going to find mating groups. So it's a very special field site. So I think I'll show the first video. So these are videos that were just filmed. I was just in New Zealand November, December. So these were filmed from a drone. So I did a lot of my PhD work filming from a boat, but these were actually from a drone. So we can see that they're pretty active groups. The female's typically in the lead with several males chasing beneath her. And so the white bellies are males. So female is belly down, the males are underneath her. And there's our boat there as well. So pretty active chases. So in the next video, I'm going to slow it down a bit and go through each different behavior types that we observe. So these were done from the boat-based follows, not from the drone. And I'll talk even faster and follow the videos. So the male is swimming inverted. So whenever you see the white belly flash, that's the male. Female belly down, male's belly up. And then he pushes the female to the surface. So essentially he's using the water like a wall where the female has nowhere to escape. So he forces her against the surface of the water. Something unusual we saw is that we'll have a male and a female swimming together, and then a second male will come underneath and get in position for when that first male breaks away. But they're not cooperating. So each male has less opportunities to mate with her, but they seem to be in position. So she's going to leap through the water here, and the male's in position, ready for when she lands to mate with her. And then interference basically means that a pair is copulating, and another male will break them apart. So in this case, he goes in front of them to push them apart, or he could roll over them. So in terms of female behaviors, she does a tail slap, which gives her propulsion to break away, or it could be kind of like a back-off symbol. We see a lot of direction changes where the female swerves to the left and the right to try to evade the male. There's the female on the top again. Keep in mind these animals don't have any appendages to hold each other in place. So when she's rolling her body, she's basically moving so her vagina is no longer accessible to the male. So she's rolling belly up so the male can't align his penis with her. In terms of reorientation leap, she leaps through the air and that sort of gives her an opportunity to break away. And then we have these speed bursts where the animals are moving up to 25 knots per hour. So that's quite a bit. So they just take off, and that seems to be a way to separate the slow animals from the fast animals. And then a spy hop means that she's going to stick her face under the water, and when she does so, the male just overshoots her. So those are the different behaviors that we observed, which is pretty amazing considering that no one's described mating behaviors in detail of any dolphin whale or porpoise before. We were able to document a huge variety. And one of the studies that we found, one of the questions I get asked a lot is whether or not females are able to choose between the different males. And so with these drone videos, it provides a really unique example where we can see them from above and we can actually track them. So soon we'll know if the same males mate with the female or not. But one thing we found from these boat-based videos is that the female uses certain behavior types given what a male is doing. So if a male does an inverted swim, a female is more likely to respond with a tail slap than to respond with a leap through the water. So it seems that females are paying attention to the males. They are paying attention to the male behaviors, and they're changing their behaviors accordingly, which suggests that they are able to discriminate between these different males and do have the capacity to exercise mate choice. So that was one of our main findings.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Do you see any of the male behaviors that correlate more with male high quality or not? And are the females able to pick certain behaviors that are, indicative of a better male or not?
So one thing to keep in mind with these males is that they're swimming upside down, which means they're holding their breath while the female is breathing. So it could be that the longer you can hold your breath while swimming at speed is indicative of your ability to potentially escape a predator or to catch food as well. Especially when we see those speed bursts where the animals take off at 25 kilometers an hour, the female tends to be in the lead and maybe 2 out of the 6 males will keep up with her, and those males will catch her first and have more opportunities to mate. So it does seem that speed is really important and agility is really important. So in a lot of the toothed whale species, we see that males are really, really big and they engage in fighting with each other. In dusky dolphins, the males and females are similarly sized and they have really large testes. So to give you an example, their testes is something like 8.5% of their body weight, which is one of the highest reported testes to body sizes amongst any mammal. So that would be like a 170-pound human walking around with 10-pound testes. So huge testes, which are really important because it's thought that they're engaging in sperm competition where the male with the most sperm or the best sperm or the most virile sperm is able to compete inside her reproductive tract. So it's a combination of being very maneuverable and having a lot of sperm to ejaculate during each of these mating events over here.
Awesome. So at this point, we want to open up the conversation. So if anybody has any questions related to what we've discussed so far, yeah?
When the females are, when they're engaging in this behavior, is there any indication that they're in fear or stressed out, or is this like a normal part of social behavior?
So it seems that they're very evasive. So of all the behaviors that we've recorded in these mating groups, we've never seen anything which would be soliciting a mating. We've never seen the females very passive. That's which would suggest that they are actively trying to evade males as opposed to some of the other populations I've studied, which I'll talk about shortly. That being said, this past trip to New Zealand in November, December, we saw a few really unusual events. So we saw an event where we had a nursery group where it was moms and calves, and a male came into the group and separated out one mom-calf pair and kept trying to mate with her. And then we saw an attempted infanticide group, which was actually horrible to watch, where about 30 dolphins were trying to kill and to drown one calf over there as well. So it seems that if you're not receptive to males, there's a possibility that a male will try to kill your offspring, or that it will incur some sort of physical cost of harm to you as well. So for the most part, these females do appear to be relatively evasive, and it's possible that because they're not losing out on foraging opportunities, they have the opportunity to be evasive of males, but there always are costs. So if you have a calf and you're not willing to mate with the male, he might come and try to kill your calf as well. It was actually pretty crazy. It was like herd mentality, where it was very tight circles on white water where they just kept trying to drown this calf. And we never saw what happened at the end. We ran out of drone footage, but it does seem that there is a reason to occasionally be receptive to these males.
So is the infanticide, is it to bring the female back into estrus, or is it like an anger?
The thought would be that, lactation is extremely expensive for these animals, and in most of these species, lactation can be in some species it's up to 17 years, but in dusky dolphins it's about 3 years or so until they have the next calf. And so if you kill off that calf, she's going to go into estrus again quicker, and then she'll be more receptive to mating again quicker is the idea.
Dark. It's pretty dark.
Questions about it?
Yeah.
I have a more anatomical question. So these giant testes, are they external or internal?
So they are internal, and I'll talk more about anatomy in the next two little vignettes, but the penis structures are really, really interesting. So everything is kept internal to the body to reduce drag forces acting on them. But there is seasonal changes in their testes size as well. So we know that during the austral summer, we're more likely to see mating, and that they're going to have larger testes, which then become smaller when they're not in the peak mating season.
Cool. Yeah, let's have one more question and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Are the so I don't know very much about dolphin social groups, but are they dynamic in size? Do they is it like some join together at some point and then?
Yep. So this particular population of dusky dolphins is considered fission-fusion, so groups constantly are coming together, breaking apart with very weak bonds between individuals. So in this area, there's about 2,000 dolphins present at any given time of a larger national population of 13,000 dolphins that cycle through the area. And they form really large pods, especially to avoid predators like killer whales and sharks, where the pods can be 200 to 300 animals large as well. And then these mating groups and these nursery groups tend to be much smaller, with maybe 8 dolphins in there. But for the most part, they're in very large groups, and then there's smaller solitary groups.
All right, cool. So our next kind of topic that we wanted to talk about, since we were talking about how females are constantly evading males and males are constantly competing for females, why don't you go into a little bit about kind of this topic of female choice and what other things you've been researching that leads to understanding female choice better in this population?
Sure. Can you click on the next slide, please? Okay. So this is one of my favorite slides, and I've actually made a magic mug of this as well. So what we're looking at over here are a bunch of excised reproductive tracts. So they've been taken out of the animals, and I will say that these were all animals that died of natural causes. I'm not going out killing marine mammals, and they were all collected under permits over here. So these animals die, they're beach cast, and then there's a bunch of, in every state which is by the coast, there's a a marine mammal response society or network, which responds to these dead animals and does animal autopsies called necropsies to understand why they died and the causes and to try to decipher more information. And luckily, these different networks are amazing at collecting specimens as well, and they all know if a marine mammal dies and it's pretty fresh, send Dara their vagina or penis. It's kind of luckily, there's not that many other people doing this, so it seems to be well understood. Oh, you have a vagina? Send it to Dara. So I get very stinky packages. I got 3 packages in the mail today that smell pretty bad. So what we're looking at over here are these excised reproductive tracts. And I've made it so they're all lying on their back, and to orient you, I think I have the little slide over here. So the top of them is the uterine horn, so they are mammalian, they're very similar to humans, except they have these 2 horns. And then we have over here the uterus, the cervix, and the vagina. And inside these, and so they're lying on their back, and I made an incision down their belly, so I've splayed them open. Whoops, went too far ahead. And inside these blue boxes are these really weird structures called vaginal folds. So all other animals don't have anything between the clitoris and the cervix. There's no other extra tissue in there. They're just smooth muscle throughout. But dolphins, whales, and porpoises, and their closest relatives, which are even-toed ungulates, have these really weird structures called vaginal folds, which are of unknown function. And so it's thought, or they were first discovered in the 1700s, and it was thought, oh, they're a way to keep salt water out of the reproductive tract because salt water is lethal to sperm. So that was the main hypothesis. But I actually think they play a role, or another suggestion was somehow they keep the fetus in during diving, which doesn't make any sense to me at all. But most of the theories were that they're a way to prevent salt water from getting in, but there are 4 species of river dolphins, and we know that one of them has vaginal folds, even though they're not in a marine environment. And then we know that seals, sea lions, walruses, manatees, and sea otters, which are also in a marine environment, don't have any such structures. So that logic to me is a little bit, it needs a little bit more evidence. But what I think is that these vaginal folds play a role in sexual selection. So my initial thought was that females were able to actively contract these muscles and expel sperm from undesirable males. So as I mentioned before, and this is what I initially pitched to my PhD advisor at that conference, this concept that like maybe females can contract muscles and control paternity, which is outrageous. But there's this concept called cryptic female choice, which is essentially that females have mechanisms to control paternity after they've copulated with a male. So she could choose not to nourish the fetus or not to move the sperm towards the egg, or different ways internally to control paternity that the male would never know about. And so this is pretty common in a variety of insects, and we also know it exists in a couple species of birds, but it's never been demonstrated before in a mammal, and the mechanism is completely unknown over here. So we don't know much about the musculature. So my thought was that there's 3 different types of muscles. So there's smooth muscle, which is under involuntary control. So as you eat your pizza, you can't really control how your stomach muscles contract to process that pizza. There's striated muscle, which is under voluntary control, so I can control moving my arm like that. And then there's cardiac muscle, which is found in the heart, and if I found that in a dolphin vagina, that would be very exciting, but not realistic. So we basically took tissue samples from these vaginal folds and from the lower vaginal tissue, and we looked at the musculature to understand what kind of muscles were there and if there were differences in terms of the actual makeup. And what we found is that there actually was not any variation in anything. They basically look the same if they were a sexually mature or an immature animal. It looked the same if it was vaginal tissue or vaginal fold tissue. So it didn't really support the hypothesis, but that being said, in these animals where cryptic female choice is known, there's never been striated muscle ever found inside vaginal tissue before, so it was a long shot anyhow. But it could be that the tissues are moving by some other mechanism of paralysis, or peristalsis, not paralysis, sorry. So we're actually doing a lot more looking at innervation patterns to understand how nerves are actually feeding in towards these different tissues over here. And I'll talk in the next vignette, I won't jump ahead as well, but I still think these vaginal folds play a role in terms of controlling paternity to a large extent. So one thought was that they might actually occlude, or they might become a barrier to the sperm, but I actually think they're a barrier to the penis, which is different. Something else while I'm just looking at these reproductive tracts that I'm working, the reason I'm back here at Mount Holyoke, I just got back here this week, I guess, is to look at the clitorises. So the question I get asked the most often is this sex pleasurable for dolphins? And the reason people ask me this is because apparently it's on a Snapple bottle. That's what I'm always told. But then also, dolphins have sex year-round, just like humans, but they have very short periods of estrus. So they can only conceive for a very small period of the year, but they have sex year-round. And they're one of the only animal groups that do that as well. So people want to know, why would they possibly have sex if they're not able to conceive? So the thought is it's for pleasure. So I do want to mention that sex can have a variety of functions besides for conceiving. So it can be for fun. It can also be for social bonding and for social, so males and females can work out hierarchies of who's a dominant male versus a more subordinate one. And we see an awful lot of homosexual mating, especially with bottlenose dolphins. We see more homosexual mating than heterosexual mating. And then it's also possible that sex could be a way for animals to learn too. So you learn by experience. So there's a lot of, and it could be play. So there's a lot of functions. So the way we're answering this question is by looking at the clitoris morphology and looking at how nerves are actually feeding into clitoris to understand how they're stimulated. So that's a pretty exciting new project that we're working on now. Yeah.
That's amazing. So yeah, one of my questions was, I don't know if this has been documented in any other mammals, but you were talking about like paternity control and other kinds of animals like insects and birds and stuff. Do dolphins have the ability to store sperm and then fertilize it later? Because I know that happens in some other animals as well, but...
So even within mammals, bats are really unique in that a lot of them have a system, going back to bats because that's what I used to know, but they do something called swarming where they all come together in a certain season, and it's basically several males mate with several females, and they store that sperm until they wake up from hibernation. So in bats, they're able to store sperm. And in pinnipeds, which are the seals and sea lions, they have something called delayed implantation, where essentially the sperm fertilizes the egg and then it stops in development at the blastocyst stage. So it completely just remains dormant into a certain period of the year, and then it kicks off so that offspring are always born at the exact same time of year when conditions are most favorable, either less predators or better food resources. Among cetaceans, we don't know of any delayed implantation or the ability to store sperm. And as far as we know, the sperm is only viable up to 48 hours in mammals. So they don't have any ducts to store anything in there. I should also mention, while I'm thinking about it, that people ask me often if there's twins as well, if you could have multiple paternities. And so cetaceans only have one offspring. The highest rate of twinning is in fin whales, and it's something like 1.2%, and only one of the offsprings are viable. So there's only one offspring at a time, and it's the actual length of pregnancy is usually about 11 months to 12 months. And then, as I mentioned, lactation can be a minimum of a year in the toothed whales, and then usually much shorter in the baleen whales.
All right, so at this point, we could probably go for some more questions if anybody has any burning dolphin questions. Yeah?
Are the vaginal folds located before the cervix or after the cervix?
So they are, if we're talking about head to tail, they're, and the cervix would be, so they're more towards the tail, so they're more caudal. And what's interesting is that they tend to be pretty concentrated near the cervix though, which is where the sperm would typically deposit or where the penis would end. What I found, I was fortunate enough, I haven't looked at very many even-toed ungulates, but they also have similar structures. And those were called pseudocervical folds because they look like fake cervices. And those tend to be even more towards the head, even more cranial compared to the cetaceans.
So, my question is, usually when an animal wants to ejaculate, they always need some sort of stimulus or something. I guess my question is, like, do they have a form of, like, I guess humping in the water, or those folds hold it and stimulate it from there?
It's something we don't know well, but there is a paper that came out maybe 2 years ago about spontaneous ejaculation in I believe it was a bottlenose dolphin that just spontaneously ejaculated. And we see a lot of petting as well, where the animals might rub their genitalias against each other. So the actual alignment of the penis, these are animals that don't have any appendages. And so the alignment of the penis into the vagina is going to be very critical towards an animal being able to copulate successfully. So it could be that in that alignment, there is some contact between the penis against these folds over there, and that could be the stimulus that they need.
All right.
Although that being said, there's a lot of work done with captive animals to collect sperm, And there, it's surprising, but one of the easiest things to train a whale or a dolphin to do is to ejaculate on command just by touching like a spot on their belly. And so they have these devices called artificial vaginas, which are essentially silicone tubes. And so they're able to teach the dolphins or whales to put their penis into these artificial vaginas and to ejaculate on command as well with very little stimulus.
Wow.
We're working on making biomimetic artificial vaginas right now.
Wow.
Another reason I'm here is to make a fake vagina. Yeah.
I imagine that it must have to happen pretty quick if they're like flipping around in the water.
So I'll show a video in the very last slide of harbor porpoises where the entire contact between the male and the female is less than a second. So it's very quick. And
So are you seeing that the tissue structures such as this, and I think you call it cryptic, or the ability for the female to control paternity, is that only arising in animals that have more males than females? Like, what would be the evolutionary disadvantage to not, like, why wouldn't humans have that, or why wouldn't all female?
so it seems that, and a lot of and a question I get asked a lot as well is, why would females want to exclude certain males from paternity? Don't all animals want to just be constantly pregnant and having offspring isn't at the point of life? And so we don't see cryptic female choice in most species. It seems to be in animals which have some sort of unusual structure inside the reproductive tract and where they are in a multi-mate system.
Okay.
So it does seem to be unique to multi-mate animals, which is 95% of mammals.
Okay, cool.
But very few, none have ever been documented having evidence of cryptic female choice.
All right. So I guess that's a perfect kind of segue into our next topic. So can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, the anatomy and this evolution of male and female coevolution and copulatory fit? If you want to.
Okay, so sort of been introducing things from the idea of the females being very evasive, and I haven't talked as much about the male perspective as well. So we have this idea, which sort of fits with the last question, that animals cooperate in order to mate, but sometimes males and females are not cooperating. And so they might be co-evolving together in this evolutionary arms race where the male will evolve one mechanism and the female will evolve a counter mechanism, and the male evolves something else, and it's this constant race in terms of evolution for one sex to be the head of the other in terms of controlling paternity. So one of my favorite examples is my collaborator here at Holyoke and UMass, Patricia Brennan. And what she discovered is that she did not discover this, but what we know is that most waterfowl, or most birds don't have a penis-like structure, but waterfowl do. And typically, birds are monogamous. So most birds are monogamous, but if you're a male that doesn't find a mate, what do? So a lot engage in something called forced extra pair copulation. So they basically force themselves on females who are already in monogamous pairs. And the females tend to be very behaviorally, resistant. And so what Patricia found is that males have this really weird penis, which is anti-clockwise shaped, so it looks kind of like a corkscrew that goes the reverse anti-clockwise. And females have a vagina, which is clockwise shaped. So their anatomy goes in the opposite direction and has all these weird twists and turns and blind recesses in there. So basically, when a male is engaged in forced extra pair copulation, that penis is not going to fit very deep into the vagina because the anatomy is going in different directions. But if she's cooperative and she relaxes and contracts those vaginal muscles, the penis is able to go deeper inside her, which means that the sperm has less distance to travel to fertilize the eggs. So this is the idea that the male and female anatomy have co-evolved together with these crazy spirals going on over there as a way to control paternity. So I noticed that this was, and the whole reason I first came here is to work with Patricia, because she had this idea and all these techniques to study these weird, spirally, unusual structures. So cetaceans seem to be a really good model as well, because they also have really weird reproductive structures, as I've mentioned. So, it's like I need to skip over here. So what we're looking at over here is a female vagina of a harbor porpoise, they're some of the most complicated reproductive tracts, so I can also pass this around before I forget. So this is an endopass of the inside of a harbor porpoise vagina over here. So this is to scale. So when we got the dead animals, we first made a cast of them, and so we use these for measurements, which I'll be talking about shortly. And so we can see that there's all these really weird structures and folds inside these vaginas, and we know that the penis is also really interesting because in both cetaceans and even-toed ungulates, they have something called a fibroelastic penis, which means that the penis is full of elastin tissues and very resistant to bending, as opposed to most animals which have a blood and gorge system. And so the tip of the penis is actually under voluntary control, and I didn't show the video, but I have a video of like a male moving its penis to snake charmer music. It's been trained to move its penis like under complete voluntary control. So the question is really, we know that females have these weird structures, these weird twists and turns and folds and recesses. We know the penis is under voluntary control. How do they actually fit together? And it may seem intuitive that penises fit in vaginas, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So we wanted to understand exactly how the anatomy fit and what's going to lead to the best possible copulation. So our approach, only one is spinning. Okay, ignore the spinny for a second. But basically, our approach was a little bit interesting and has been getting some media. So we took a bunch of dead dolphin and whale penises and porpoise penises and found a way to inflate them. So we basically used a nitrogen tank and then pump that into a beer keg full of saline and then pump that into these penises. So we're able to simulate erection in these dead animals. And then we were able to fix those so they hold their shape. And then we put them into the vaginas and we did CT scans of them together. And what we found, what I just want to highlight over here is that, so the penis over here of the harbor porpoise has this really weird kink right over here at the top, which is not an artifact. And that fits perfectly into the largest vaginal fold over here. So that's what we found in the CT scan as well. That here we have the females on the bottom, and so this is the penis on the inside. And so the penis tip, that large kink, is the same thing over here, and then the tip is obviously the animal's dead, so we couldn't inflate it all the way. But basically, the large kink over here gets caught on this largest vaginal fold, and the penis can't penetrate any deeper. So as I mentioned before, we thought these vaginal folds initially were a way to control sperm movement by dumping sperm from undesirable males, but it actually looks like they co-evolved with the penile morphology, and we did this in 4 different species, 3 of cetaceans and 1 of a seal, and we found consistently that the male and female anatomy seem to co-evolve together, so we have this evidence of co-evolution between males and females, where these large vaginal folds are preventing the sperm or the penis from moving further. So to make this more interesting, we then tried taking our images of the female, and our penises, which we were able to create 3D models, and the cast which is being passed around, and we superimposed them over each other and kept rotating them to see which angle would give the deepest possible penetration. And what we found is that the way for the penis to go the deepest is if that big kink gets caught onto that large vaginal fold, which is a dorsal, which means that the male is basically swimming with his belly towards her back, which seems a little bit counterintuitive. Oftentimes the animals mate belly to belly. But I'm very fortunate that one of my field sites is San Francisco, where harbor porpoises have sex right beneath the Golden Gate Bridge. And so essentially the San Francisco Bay Area is funnel shaped and the narrowest point is right under the bridge. So every day the tide goes in and out and males wait for the tide to come so they know females are going to follow fish with the tide, and they wait right underneath the bridge and they have sex right underneath the bridge at high tide every day. So pretty exciting to watch that. So I spend a lot of time in San Francisco standing on the bridge just filming porpoises having sex. And what we see is pretty amazing, that the male leaps through the water. He waits for the female to be at the surface, and he leaps through the water and tries to mate with her while she's taking a breath over there. And in this video, we can see that, again, his stomach is towards her back, as you would expect based on the anatomy, and that also this kink inside the penis is not an artifact of the post-mortem effects, that it actually is this really weird structure over there. And so in the picture on the right over here is an example where we saw the penis go into the vagina, and as predicted based on anatomy, the male's stomach is towards the female's back. So we essentially, while in the air, in less than a second, loops his penis around her entire body into her vagina while leaping through the air. So I'll just show a video of that. So this is one that was just sent to me a couple of weeks ago. A very elaborate case. So the male came at the female, maybe we'll watch it again. He came at her, or does it slow it down? I'm not sure if you click on that. So we'll watch it one more time. So that was at normal speed, but the male comes to the female at such force that, in this case, he pushed her through the water. So he flipped her all the way through the water, and the whole thing is less than a second long as well. Wow. So pretty, I mean, someone asked before how long it takes, so that's how long. Typically, you blink and you miss it, it's just a splash in the water.
Wow. So I have a question. How do, I guess, I don't know how many different species of dolphins there are on the coast of California or in New Zealand for that matter, but how do individuals recognize each other? Like, how do they talk to each other? Do they recognize like patterns on their body, or how does a male see a dolphin in distance and knows that it's same species?
So there are a lot of hybrids where you have different species which tend to mate together as well, although I imagine that these reproductive anatomy barriers would prevent that. There's a lot of different thoughts on how animals could recognize each other, and we have one of the experts in the world on that who can tell you more about signature whistles and the idea that some dolphins have unique vocal signatures which are recognized by others, so that might be one possibility. I also have I read a paper recently where someone looked at dolphin faces and was able to tell faces apart from individuals. So maybe dolphins look at each other's faces and can see some sort of differences there. As researchers, we usually look at their dorsal fins, which tend to acquire a bunch of nicks and notches, and that's how we tell them apart. But it could be that dolphins are using visual cues, although more likely, because they have such amazing echolocation skills, it probably is a combination of acoustics. We know that their chemosensation, so their sense of taste, is not very good. So it's probably largely to do with sound and something with the signatures of the calls, or in general, sounds from different species are going to have different frequencies and different pitches and be at different rates as well.
So can one species potentially only hear others from its same species?
They would hear each other. So for example, killer whales have adapted to be there's a few different types of killer whales, but the ones that feed on other marine mammals have adapted to be very quiet when they're about to attack animals, because otherwise the dolphins would hear them. So they definitely hear each other.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so does anybody have any questions at the moment? Yeah.
So I guess through these modeling of the organs, you can tell morphologically the best fit or the deepest fit. But then is there a way to follow up with the female afterwards or track the different females based on the different styles to see which one was most successfully inseminated after?
It's something we've thought about, but that would mean you'd have to be able to track a female for her entire year, let's say, and see every single mating event, and then be able to backtrack and know which male was the one that inseminated her and which event it was. So even with animals in captivity, it would be very tricky to even figure it out then, because you'd have to see every single copulation event and know which one was the one to leave to insemination. But it's something we're definitely interested in. If you have ideas, it's something I've thought about for a while. Just don't know how logistically to do that.
So is it possible that the size of the testes is because, do they need to generate more sperm, because it seems like this would result in a lot of misses, a lot of like wasted sperm that doesn't reach its target?
So I actually submitted a paper today looking at the relationship between testes size, vaginal complexity, and anatomy. And it's not as clear a pattern as we would think, although for the most part, animals with more complicated vaginal folds tend to have larger testes. So for example, the harbor porpoises have very complicated vaginas and relatively large testes as well, relative to most of the other dolphins, whales, and porpoises. And then bottlenose dolphins have very small testes and very simple vaginas relative to other species. So that's only looking at a couple of species, but I'm sure if we add more on, I would imagine there's a pattern between larger testes equal more complicated reproductive tracts. But adding the behavior in there was not as clear a pattern. I'll let you choose.
Oh, I don't know.
Just letting me go first. Is there, in doing that review, was there any correlation between like more complicated organs and rarer species?
So the most complicated reproductive tract I've looked at was a calf. It was a sperm whale, where we opened it up on a Friday at like noon, and I promptly just closed it back up because I knew it was going to take me 10 hours to do it. So we counted 39 vaginal folds, as opposed to a bottlenose dolphin, which has 1. So by a rare species, sperm whales are relatively, I wouldn't say they're common,
Right.
but it's unclear, and we've tried plotting complexity. So last year I worked with colleagues here, and we actually looked at the shape of the entire reproductive tract. And we tried to see how that correlated with the taxonomic relatedness, the phylogeny, and didn't find that there was some sort of signature that the more closely related you are, the more similar your reproductive tract shapes were going to be. So it doesn't, to me, this sounds weird, but if you send me a dead dolphin vagina in the male, I can tell you, give or take, what species it is or what genus it is. That I've seen enough. I think I'm at something like 40 of the 90 species now. So to me, I can tell you, like I've gotten specimens and say, did you mislabel the label? Because I'm pretty sure this is, they said, yeah, we actually did mislabel it. Like I can tell them apart. But based on the shape analysis, it seems I'm just really weird. Maybe I'll make a guidebook or a key book of how to tell. Did that answer your question?
Tell itself, yeah.
So I don't know if you're gonna get into this, but if copulation is happening that quickly and at that difficult of an angle, but the structures are inside, like the structures are concealed in the male, what I guess I'm curious, is the penis just really long? Or like, are they shooting it out really fast? Or are they like, during mating events, are they like swimming around with it, like ready to go?
So the penis is always external to the body prior to that mating event.
Okay.
And I think that what's really amazing, at least with the harbor porpoises, is that their cervix is, it's asymmetrical inside the reproductive tract. And the male always approaches the female from one side of her body as well. So it could be that we have this coevolution of behavior of the male's one-sided approach and the female's asymmetrical reproductive tract as a way that if a female were to slightly tilt her body to the left or the right, that would control how close the penis is able to align to that asymmetry. So I do think that the female anatomy is good. So the penis is fully erect and it is external prior to the male trying to copulate. So one of the projects I'm working on now also is trying to understand the penis tissue, because it must be amazingly, amazingly tough tissue to resist the drag forces from the water swimming around with your penis up to your chin. Like the harbor porpoise, let me go back a picture over here. It's 3/4 of its body size. Like its penis comes up to its chin over there. So that's a lot of drag acting on the penis as well over there. But yes, I think the female, I think I've diverted from your question, but I think that the female angle, if she turns her body left or right, could actually be a way for her to control paternity for some extent. So we know the anatomy has to fit at the exact right angle, so she might be able to control who's going to be able to get at the best angle.
Yeah?
Is there any way you've been able to deduce how a female at that moment can decide this is a good male? I should turn a little bit more or less? Or
So you're asking how she might select the
selection
male?
in that. What do you think? Maybe something is being communicated slightly before the actual contact?
So I think with the dusky dolphins, where there are these elaborate 10-minute chases going on, the male has different behaviors and the females respond differently. I think in those cases the female is selecting based on that male or his characteristic or something about him. With these harbor porpoises, the female's at the surface taking a breath and seems to be caught completely off guard over there. So it seems that in that case, she seems to be startled. Like almost every time it seems to be a pretty adverse response where she'll stick her tail up, but she usually seems to be startled because the female is larger than the male, so if she didn't want to mate with him, it would be pretty easy for her to just swat him or move away. So it seems in that case it seems in this case, the startle response or this ambush approach seems to work better for the males.
Yeah?
Do you know if, or could it be possible that the folds in the vagina are due or have evolved to rather retain sperm inside instead of it, having a clear track back outside the vagina?
That's certainly a possibility, and something I'd like to one day do is to put to let a male and female in captivity mate, and then once they mate, to put an endoscope inside the female and see where sperm retains in there. So it's something I've thought about a lot, that it could be a way to hold the sperm, but I'm not sure how else we'd be able to test that. Again, I'm open to suggestions.
All right, so it sounds like you've done some field work in some pretty fascinating places, from San Francisco to New Zealand. Are there where else have you done field work, and what are maybe some of your favorite places or experiences that you've had?
Oh goodness, so this was not a favorite place or experience. I don't know if I should say this on video. But I also, my postdoc is actually based in Halifax, where I'm studying an endangered species of northern bottlenose whales. So we went 300 kilometers offshore and lived on a sailboat for a month with no electricity, following a population of whales there, and that was I have pretty good sea legs. I've never been seasick before, but to be seasick for a month was a pretty miserable experience. Yeah, when you're that far offshore.
And where exactly is that? I don't.
It's an area called the Gully in the Scotian Shelf, so it's
Okay.
kind of middle of the ocean, not middle of the ocean, but pretty far offshore.
Wow. And did you find the population? Did you
Yeah.
get the data you wanted?
Yeah, so I have a student now, an honor student, who's presenting it this weekend, and we're actually looking at leadership patterns. So the idea that one individual in the group will dive or do a turn and all the other individuals will follow. So leadership hasn't been very well documented in cetaceans before, but we think we have evidence that one individual will have a more active role in controlling what the rest of the group does as well. So that was one pretty unique experience.
Cool. Very cool.
You'll never forget your summer on a sailboat.
Awesome. Do we have any remaining questions from the audience? All right, cool. Oh, yeah?
Do you have suggestions for like the best time of day/year to see harbor porpoises under the Golden Gate Bridge?
So yes, so we actually documented that they mate every single month of the year we found them. The summertime is actually the worst because there's a lot of fog. So so I was just there January 15th, I guess a couple weeks ago. And it was really, I was there for a conference, but also trying to film them. And you have to coordinate it that you have the high tide also when there's light. So high tide, I think, was at 4 a.m. and 6 p.m., which didn't help very much as well. But not summer because of the fog. But just go there high tide, maybe half an hour before, half an hour after, and look down, and it'll happen.
Yeah, Katie?
So it's related to where their location when mating. Do a lot of marine mammals mate close to the surface of the water, and is that because they can push the female? Is that, like you mentioned, that they tend to push the female off to the surface? Is
So we don't know most species. The harbor porpoises and the dusky dolphins for sure is at the surface of the water. And with the dusky dolphins, we calculated in the mating group, they spend 92% while mating at the surface of the water. So we're confident we're seeing almost everything. The population of Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphins I study in Egypt, those are filmed scuba diving, and those are near like the bottom as well. So it's possible that most of the species, we don't know much about them because they're mating where we can't see them. That's a possibility. So some species like right whales tend to have these active groups at the surface, but most, if they're mating way beneath the surface, some are far offshore. That would explain why so little is known.
And there might be, in that case, since there is variation between where they mate, could that relate somehow to the complexity of the organs?
So looking at bottlenose dolphins, so I've received and harbor porpoises as well, I've received specimens from all over both coasts and from most of the states where these animals occur. And a harbor porpoise is a harbor porpoise, and a bottlenose dolphin is a bottlenose dolphin. So there is a possibility that there's regional variation in the morphology, but I would say it's relatively conserved within a species, that it's pretty similar within a given species, whether it's a harbor porpoise from the UK or a harbor porpoise from San Francisco. They have these crazy vaginal folds that look very much like the endocast that's going around.
I think I was more asking about between species. Are the organs more complex depending on if the species mates closer to the surface and if it's deeper down? Does the complexity of the organs vary between species?
Right.
More vaginal folds.
So my answer is that we don't know the mating patterns of most species to answer that question. So I have the vaginas of 40 species, but we've only observed 5 species mating. So we don't have enough evidence of the mating behaviors to answer that question yet, unfortunately. But it could very well be.
Thanks.
Sorry, I have a lot of questions.
All right, last question, then we'll wrap it up. Yeah.
So it seems like technological advancements have made this research a lot easier or more accessible. Are there any like technological advancements coming up that you're excited about that could like improve your ability to study these types of things?
Sure. So I actually consider myself to be very much so like a bare bones, like no funded researcher where all I need is a scalpel and I'm good to go kind of thing. But the drone research that we just did a couple months ago has been really, really exciting. And so that's something really promising. And with CT scans and all the things we can do with 3D imaging seems to be a really promising direction. We're also trying to understand more about the forces of copulation, so even putting force transducers inside these fake vaginas and looking at properties. So definitely, I would say mostly behaviorally the drone stuff, and mostly with the anatomy, CT scans and big advances there offer a lot of promise of where we can take this in new directions.
Cool. All right. Well, everyone, please join me in thanking Dara. We'll see everybody on March 8th. Thank you all for coming.